of course, we're talking today about civil war or ceasefire, and it's a full room, and hopefully we'll have a good interaction with everyone about a contentious issue, which is Lebanon. It's a small country, but it always draws a certain public and some interest. Anyway, with me here to discuss it all, and not only Lebanon and what happened in Lebanon in the last while, but also in the regional and international context, and why Lebanon and what is happening and what led basically to this ceasefire, and or whether we're expecting a civil war. To my right is Jonathan. Jonathan Spire is a research fellow at Herzliya in Israel. And to my left, Alistair Harris, independent security consultant, ex-diplomat, and also ex-UN staffer. Ian Black is the Middle East editor of The Guardian newspaper. Initially, I'm supposed to moderate, but because I'm the only Lebanese here, apparently, I was brought in. I was told that I should maybe also take part. Initially, this will work. Each will speak 3-4 minutes, and hopefully we'll keep it short, and we'll put in context our opinion or our viewpoint in order to stir debate, basically. Civil war, and we've heard it. Everybody is talking about it lately, and we're using it, but is it in the right scope and meaning? Are there two warring parties in Lebanon today? What are the ingredients for a civil war? Usually, civil war is, as we all know, it descends slowly, it's gradual. There is no such event as one event that leads to civil war. And, but it does happen, or it builds up when dialogue becomes irrelevant. The parties involved resort to violence to settle their differences. We've seen that happening over in Lebanon before, 1975, when the civil war started. It lasted 15 years. And then the Taif Agreement ended the war and established a new order in Lebanon. Today, many fear the return of the civil war. I think they are right to entertain such concerns. I think for Lebanon there is a secret recipe. If the conditions in the regions are ripe, the Lebanese are ready to fight. And this is my point of view. You can contest this with me. And I think recently we've seen something similar. And a party used arms and raised arms. A certain section of the Lebanese raised their arms to assert their views. And initially, the conflict started when there were no leeways left for opposing parties. And when you use weapons, directly or indirectly, you're stimulating others to use weapons for whatever reasons. And if we're going to talk about about ceasefire, also the ceasefire doesn't come like this. It is also after the conditions are ripe. And for some reason, Lebanon, like the interest here in this room, attract a lot of attention. Not only its people are highly politicized, but also the region is involved in Lebanon, and the international scene as well has its input in Lebanon. So to avoid the civil war, the ceasefire but it comes after certain energy, i.e. to engage people and to have the courage, i.e. the warring parties or the conflicting parties, to concede what they want, what they were after for the public interest. I'm not going to talk too much, but the ceasefire agreement that came after the Qatar and the Doha deal did not come out of the blue. It came because there were right conditions in the region, but also it came when certain party to the conflicts realized certain issues, basically. And Qatar used a certain ripe moment in the regional and international debate, as well as within the domestic Lebanese scene, and jumped in as more or less a neutral party and pushed all the parties toward the table. And this happened, and it was a favor to everybody. I think you might agree or disagree with me. Hezbollah, who realized how damaging it was to use arms in the internal setting of Lebanon, although it promised always not to use it. And also, it came to save the 14th of March movement, who were, until that stage, political forces, and they were never ready to pick up arms and fight, despite the fact that the takeover of Beirut showed them up, and they were routed basically from Beirut, or whoever basically armed element that they have. Also from the regional side and point of view, Iran did not so quickly the conflict descend into a sectarian Sunni-Shia connotation, and it didn't want to harm its standing in the region. And it's very important what the Islamic world think about Iran, at least for the Iranian administration. Also, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt found that there is no interest for anybody to get more or less, they have nothing to gain from this sectarian war as it was descending into. I mean, many people have maybe different opinion about that. I'm not gonna say more, but the Doha deal, in the opinion of many, has a lot of flaws. To many people, it delayed the crisis, but not solved it. I mean, we can discuss that later and see. And that's for one factor, one issue, which is the weapon of Hezbollah, or Hezbollah as a resistance party, was not discussed, and this is why the Doha agreement was reached. In Lebanon, and after the violence witnessed in Beirut, we saw concessions by everybody. I think for the deal to succeed, Hezbollah had to accept the inevitable, that no party should be allowed to have a state within a state. We've seen this fail in the past within the Lebanese context, i.e. when the Palestinians created their own state. Now this is to the test, because they are Lebanese people, a section of the Lebanese people, whether they're going to succeed or not. But in Lebanon, we've learned also one important lesson, is to be optimistic. Is there's a civil war? Lots of Lebanese now went back to the normal way of life. All of them don't believe that there will be a civil war. The ingredients are there, but so far there is none. It stopped. Will it last? We don't know. There is one more thing that I could say. In Lebanon also, one has to remember that one party cannot have the monopoly over the truth. And I think it's wise for all the Lebanese to remember, and also maybe actors in the region, what Khalil Gibran said, who is a great writer and renowned poet. He said, say you know not the truth, but a truth. And I think this is my point basically to make. Who would like to go first and try to tell us whether ceasefire or civil war? I think, Alistair, do you want to?
The short straw. Mohammed, thank you. I'm very conscious of being a foreigner outside Lebanon discussing Lebanon. Probably doesn't qualify me to talk about anything. But what I want to try and do in a couple of minutes only, because I'm more interested to hear your views and see if we can generate debates around that, is just throw in a few perhaps controversial statements and see if they generate some interest. The point Mohammed mentioned earlier about ripe moments reminds me of university studies. Zartman, the famous guy, wrote about ripe moments. The problem with ripe moments is you only know they're ripe afterwards. That's the problem. Everything looks ripe after the event. What I'd like to focus on is, if we're discussing whether we are approaching a civil war, not approaching a civil war, we're in a conflictual situation. And the thing we need to focus on clearly are the drivers of conflict. And I would urge that we look back to the reasons for the conflict, and they will be multifaceted. I am not an advocate of conflict resolution across the board, I'll be honest. Conflict management is what we are discussing, whether it be in Lebanon or elsewhere. And maybe I just throw as one option that actually freezing the situation to ensure we don't see any further deterioration should perhaps be the goal. Just a thought, anyway. One of the major problems starting at sort of high altitude and coming down is obviously Lebanon's consociational democracy. We all know confessionalism, the difficult deals that requires. It's easy if it's between a Christian Maronite and a Sunni. When Lebanon was first formed, it's a deal between elites. As the country becomes more diverse, it's very hard to negotiate changes that are a result from ideational changes, 58 Nasserism, where the country is divided on what it thinks about things, or demographic changes. The Shia demographics and others. I mean, how does a state like Lebanon negotiate peaceably the causes of conflict? So I'd ask people to think about that. If the system's broken, because what I would argue is that in order to have a functioning state, which we hope Lebanon will be, because it certainly isn't, it's very different from the concept of a nation. I mean, what is Lebanon? There have been many jokes about the fact that if you ask all different Lebanese confessions what makes Lebanon, you might get tabbouleh as a salad and maybe Fayrouz. What else? I mean, for a nation that loves its flag and loves Lebanon, what does it actually mean? So I would go back from the sense of nation and the people that embody the nation to the state. and think about the fact that at its most basic, the state is about a political deal. And we come back to our consociational model. Is the deal broken? Does the deal work? How do we ensure we don't have a situation which we've had in the past where the only way the deal can be renegotiated is through conflict? So as a sort of conflict management person interested in that, I would ask you to think about if that can be achieved in a peaceable fashion within the boundaries of Lebanon. Very, very tricky. The other question, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm being very elusive here by putting questions rather than posing any answers, is the question of national security. The arms of the resistance are touted as being there to protect Lebanon's security. And I would ask us to think about security from what and for who. I am an advocate of a wider debate on Lebanon of what security threats Lebanon is faced by and what is the most appropriate mechanism to confront those. That's a national debate, and the UK itself only came up with a national security strategy last year or earlier this year. So that's not something that's automatic. You have to have a discussion, an inclusive discussion, about what you're protecting yourselves from. And actually, what comes out of that debate might not give you the answers you want. When President Suleiman recently inaugurated, the first thing he said pretty much is Israel's the enemy. That's difficult. If you're the US government and you're $350 million into an arrangement with the Lebanese army and the former commander says Israel's the enemy, it's not going to work particularly well. So I would throw that up there. Be careful the answers you get back, because the national security threats might not be a question of Hezbollah equals anti-Israel equals bad. It might be, hold on a second, General Aoun is with the opposition and he is the largest Christian party perhaps. That's difficult for external people to understand. So I'd finish my little introductory piece on contextual knowledge. If you want to get back to understanding what Hezbollah means for Lebanese and for external actors, what Hezbollah means for Lebanese, understand the drivers of conflict, go back to the political bargain at the heart of the state and say whether it works or not. So if it doesn't work, it'll be contested. When the state cannot guarantee security, can't raise tax revenue, you get a contested state, you don't have a social contract. There isn't a social contract currently in Lebanon, and it's conflictual. Okay, so I'm very conscious that I've made no answers whatsoever, and I'm sure I'll have to earn my pittance later by answering some of those, but I just throw those up to think about at the outset. Mohammed, thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. I don't know, we're going to check, is Nicholas a no? Okay, well, maybe we'll give the opinion from the other side, from Jonathan.
Thanks. Again, very briefly, let me just make a few points. I'd like to perhaps try and see what's happened in Lebanon over the last month within a broader regional context, and to suggest that what happened at Doha represented a very clear victory for a particular regional bloc. And I think that many of my friends in Lebanon connected to the March 14th and pro-government side have found it enormously difficult to accept what seems to me at least to be the relative simplicity, unusual in a Lebanese context, of what took place in Doha. It seems to me, at least from an outside point of view, of course, that after 18 months of struggle and campaigning and demonstrations and pressure and intimidation, Hezbollah received in Doha pretty much exactly what it had been seeking. And I think in order to understand exactly how that happened and what that means, we have to remember exactly how the conflict of mid-May emerged. Because I read an article in Wall Street Journal the other day which said something like the following: well, how can you call it a Hezbollah victory when if Hezbollah were on the edge of taking power, they chose not to? That must mean that they didn't get what they wanted. This, of course, is a very simplistic understanding of what they wanted and of what Lebanon is all about. Let's remember why the fighting started in mid-May. It started because the government attempted to cross a red line which Hezbollah and its backers chose to not allow them to cross. The prospect was of an interference by the government in the autonomous military infrastructure maintained by Hezbollah in the two areas which you remember: one, replacing the head of airport security, and secondly, dismantling this internal communications network. Now, why was this so important? Why was this an absolute impassable possibility for Hezbollah? Because had they given in to that, they would have been acknowledging that the Lebanese government has a right to interfere with Hezbollah's ability to make war with whom it wishes to make war at a moment of its own choosing, which means, of course, Israel. And therefore, the matter was brought to a head. The matter which had been trundling along for 18 months was brought to a head. And the Hezbollah, the opposition, won hands down. Nadim Shkhadi, who I was hoping to see here this evening, but I see that he's not here, put it in a nice way, a very mistaken way, I think, but a nice way, when he said, what's been happening in Lebanon is it's two sides fighting a duel who have chosen different weapons. The one has chosen the weapons of Gandhi, and he means the March 14th people. The other ones have chosen the weapons of Genghis Khan. one can get lost in the very great attractiveness of Lebanese political language sometimes, in the way in which people put things. I perhaps come from a more simple tradition. I think that when you put Gandhi against Genghis Khan, the result can be foreseen. And I think that what happened in Doha was that very obviously the two sides came there. The issue of Hezbollah's weapons, of course, was not going to be brought to the table. The issue of the blocking third in cabinet, which after all is what the last 18 months of strife has been all about, was conceded, all told by the government, as a result of which what we have when we come back from Doha is ceasefire or civil war, you ask. Well, I think it was George Orwell who said the quickest way to end a war is to lose it. And I think that whilst I don't think the March have lost the war yet, but the quickest way to end a negotiation is by conceding in its entirety the demands of your enemy, of your interlocutor. This is, in essence, it seems to me, at least what happened in Doha. What we have now, therefore, it seems to me, is a period of lull. If people believe that what happened in Doha is a recipe for long-term stability and quiet in Lebanon, I think that they're very gravely mistaken. I think what happened in mid-May was that Hezbollah was guarding the boundaries of its autonomous military infrastructure, and that has implications both for Lebanon's relations with its neighbors and also for Lebanon itself. And I won't go on and on, so I'll bring it to a close in a moment. But just let me make the following point. In the last days, we have been receiving, those of us who follow this stuff, have been receiving indications and messages that the internal communications system, of which the strife in mid-May was all about, is proceeding apace. It means that some very advanced Iranian and Syrian equipment, including an Iranian encryption possibility and a command and control center are coming into Lebanon. It means that the boundary, it is enabling Hezbollah to unite its communications between the three areas in the country which it is strong, and from what we hear, move those communications possibilities into northeastern Lebanon, into areas where the organization has never been strong before. Now this has two meanings, two potential meanings. One of them is of interest to my country, to Israel, which is the following, that what this appears to indicate is that Hezbollah is getting ready for, at some stage in the future, a further conflict with Israel, and we assume they expect what to happen will be a showdown in the Bekaa between Hezbollah forces and Israel. In other words, that the next war, they assume, I think correctly, if it happens, which I hope it won't, will not be confined to southern Lebanon in terms of ground action. But this is not of interest to the Lebanese people themselves. Let me then conclude on the following 2 points. This communications system, if and when it becomes effective, enables two things to happen. First of all, it enables Hezbollah to unite the communication between all pro-Syrian or pro-Iranian military organizations in the country, for them to communicate with one another in a way which the rest of you, or the rest of the Lebanese eye, will not be able to know about. If you are planning, if the pro-government Lebanese, that is, are planning at some stage to reassert their rights and sovereignty, it's going to be much more difficult once this communication system comes into operation, one. Two, what this communication system will allow them to do is to spy on any other Lebanese and to hear what they are saying and thinking and doing and planning at any time of their moment and any time of their choosing. Once again, of very, very great implications and importance indeed. So my final point is the following. If people who are around the democratically elected government of Lebanon are concerned with its survival, if indeed it can be said that it still has any meaning, or at least with the possibility of continuing to create the Lebanon that people like Rafiq al-Hariri believed in, then the recipe of Gandhi against Genghis Khan is not the one that's going to deliver.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ian?
Thank you, Mohammed. Well, I'll go back a little bit before the immediate crisis of May. I went to Beirut for the first time in a very long time, most recently in February of this year. And I went deliberately in February because I knew clearly that it was going to be the anniversary, the third anniversary of the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005. And I thought it would be an interesting time to be there, particularly as I hadn't been for a while, to get a sense of the mood on what was clearly going to be a very symbolic day where there was clearly going to be quite a lot of activity around that date, as there indeed was. And it was fascinating to see the very impressive, I have to say, mobilization of the Mustaqbal, the Future Movement, and the March the 14th people to make a big deal out of the rally to commemorate the killing those 3 years before. Because everybody here, I'm sure you're familiar with the recent events going back to 2005 and I think the unsolved and unresolved issue of what happened then, who was responsible, one shouldn't underestimate its importance in Lebanon and indeed, of course, more widely in the region, Syria and so on and so forth. I'm sure we'll talk about that. So it was a very interesting time to be there. It was fascinating for me to see. I'm going to be sort of very, kind of journalistic about it. I won't, I'll spare you the purple prose. But it made a very powerful impression on me to see Beirut, much improved, reconstruction of the center, very impressive, very beautiful, round Martyrs Square where this very significant demonstration was taking place. A sense of the throbbing heart of a great city that has recovered amazingly. I think anybody who's been there would agree, from the destruction of the past, all those terrible pictures from 20 and 30 years ago that everybody remembers. So it was great to see it. It was fascinating to see this very significant mobilization around this totemic date. And sod's law, I thought I was going to have a quiet week to potter around, talking to people, to get a sense. It's a wonderful thing to be a journalist. You're kind of, you're paid to go to interesting places and talk to people and then try to explain to people who know even less than you do. So it was fascinating wandering around Beirut, talking to people. People were very accessible, particularly on the March the 14th side. On the other side, on the Hezbollah side, it's another story, but perhaps we can come to that in the course of the evening. So there I was, forming in my own mind a picture of what was at stake. And then, as you will know, I expect on the evening of February the 14th, in Damascus, there was a mysterious explosion, which initially was reported in a very brief sort of way, explosion in Damascus, just a couple of paragraphs on the news agencies. By the next morning, it was a different matter, because it transpired, as you will know, that the person who was killed in the explosion in Damascus was Imad Mughniyeh, who was a very, very important and much hunted leader of a notorious man, one would have to say, of Hezbollah, dating back to the bad old days of the early 1980s, when he was associated, who knows the truth of these things, with some of the most, some of the biggest events of the time, the blowing up of the American embassy, the attack on the Marine barracks, everything, blowing up Jewish community centers in Argentina, anything bad associated with Hezbollah, Mughniyeh was responsible. And he was blown up in Damascus on the evening of February the 4th, on the evening of February the 13th. On the morning of February the 14th, as thousands, I think hundreds of thousands of people were gathering in Martyrs Square in downtown Beirut to commemorate the Hariri assassination, with all the emotion and all the political organization that went with that. The other side of town, in the southern suburbs, the Dahia, Imad Mughniyeh was being given a martyr's burial. Now, again, this is part of the privilege of being a journalist. You find yourself in a situation where, unlike most people, you can cross from one side to the other. Journalists can cross the line. That's sort of what they do for a living. So having spent an hour or so watching this huge demonstration in Martyrs Square to commemorate Hariri, very, very dramatic, all those iconic pictures of Hariri and all the other people, 20 or so people perhaps, who have been killed in mysterious and as yet unsolved circumstances in the last couple of years, with one thing in common, that is, they were critics and enemies of a particular neighboring country of Lebanon. Having seen that, the emotion, the power, the organization of it, the sense that here is this really gaping wound in the heart of this country, I got into a taxi, and traffic was quite heavy. There were a lot of people around, and half an hour or so later was dropped off by a very nervous Druze driver on the edge of that sort of entrance to the Borj al-Barajni, I think it is, one of the southern suburbs, which is commonly described and correctly described as a Hezbollah stronghold. And it was an extraordinary contrast. It really was a tale of two cities. And a short drive from one place to another, there was one part of Lebanon doing its thing over an issue that it cared deeply about, And this short distance away, here was another completely different Lebanon, truly a state within a state. Not only was the Druze taxi driver absolutely unprepared to go any further than the edge of it, but the moment you went into it, certainly as a foreigner, maybe one needs to see these things through the eyes of the visiting foreigner, though I have some knowledge and experience of the place. It was going somewhere completely different. There were, men in uniform, very disciplined, controlling this whole area while the funeral rites were going on in a sort of religious complex around a mosque. There were volleys of machine gun fire being fired into the air. There was just a sense that you were in two different places simultaneously. And for me, this just really encapsulated where Lebanon was then. And I have to say, fast forward to May, we can talk about the precise circumstances of the Doha Agreement and its chances of holding. But for me, the abiding impression of that visit was this is a country which is deeply fractured, which is deeply wounded, and there is an extraordinary dichotomy between the two main sets of actors. And for me, that set the stage for what happened later. And I'll stop there, because I think everything everybody said raises lots of issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. And before I open for the floor, give some chance for some question, and I'm sure there are many, but I'm gonna maybe pick on some points raised and not in order. So I'm gonna go to Jonathan. You mentioned the Genghis Khan versus Gandhi. So what do you see? The 14th of March forces are an association, a loosely net representative or not representative forces. What other choices do they have? Especially knowing Hezbollah as a party, as a unit that has been working in the country for the past 30 years, cementing its control over its apparatuses, as you described. We're going to see even more in that part of the world. So what other choices could you see for the forces of 14th of March?
I'll answer that now. Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's a good question. The point is this. Of course, didn't mean to imply in this any criticism of the March 14th people as in and as of themselves. They had absolutely no choice but to do what they did. It is noteworthy, and I took part in conversations with friends, that people were trying to pull some shred of dignity out of what had happened. And I have a good friend in Beirut who wouldn't stop telling me as we were chatting over on the internet that, look, we were in the Shuf. The Hezbollah didn't get the best of it. In the Shuf, Jumblat held out very well, and he showed them what for. And it's not true to say, you mustn't write to say that we were swatted aside. Jumblat, and it's not nice, because the point is that this is a great person and a great friend of mine. But one has to say, yes, there is some evidence which one hears from some people that Jumblat's people put up a certain fight for a short period of time before, as we well know, rushing to negotiate very quickly and not necessarily very edifying circumstances. The March 14th people had no choice. The Americans, as we know, sent the USS Cole, if I'm not mistaken, to the Mediterranean during the course of events, and that was where it began, and that was where it ended. So March 14th is not a movement which can stand up against a pro-Iranian militia by itself if its sponsor and backer, i.e. the United States of America, is not going to help it out. And as we know, the Americans are overstretched right now in the region. Things are not going their way in a number of areas, so they were not currently able to do so. At this particular moment, therefore, I think the March 14th people had no choice. I do believe that what's going on in Lebanon is part of a much larger game of chess, if you want to use this kind of term, between the Iranians and the United States. And I think that ultimately, it seems to me at least, the fate of Lebanon and the future appearance of Lebanon will depend on the outcome of that contest, which could be with us for quite some years to come.
Alistair, you mentioned something about the national security forces defending what from what. Could they have had any chance in limiting the damage of, as Jonathan said, Genghis Khan, unleashing in towns and cities?
Good question. You put me on the spot at some point. I just want to pick up on actually something that Ian mentioned. The state within a state for Hezbollah, state within a failed state, and the armed forces are part of that. If you don't have internationally demarcated borders, if 10% of your population are not citizens of the country, if you have security islands, whatever you want to call it, Palestinian camps, Lebanon's in deep trouble. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't have the machinery of statehood. Until very recently, obviously, no president, no parliament, no cabinet that had universal acceptance in the country, I mean, the problems are rife. Now, the armed forces, a particular case, and they're often held up as the only institution of state that still works.
Do they?
But, I mean, this is the question. I mean, I've gone full circle into your question. Do they? They still exist. That's not the same thing as still being functional. And I've spoken to quite a few senior officers who are very alarmed by recent events, because you don't have to be for March the 14th or for the opposition, but you should be for the people, because that's what you do if you're an army. And especially for the Lebanese army, the legacy of Syrian times, etc., you do internal security. That's what you do. If you don't do that either, because you've been emasculated, and let's be honest, I think the Lebanese army has been emasculated, and $350 million won't solve that. You've lost that bargain where the armed forces clearly have a function within the country. Okay, so I would argue strongly that when it comes to the Lebanese army, it's a paper tiger. Much as I support it as an institution, I think it's extremely important. But again, you come back to your lack of social contract, lack of agreement of what's the army for. If it's not to protect against Israel, if it's not to protect against the Palestinian camps, just to freeze it. If it's not to protect the people of Lebanon, what's it for? It's a very big question. Now, the army is of the people. We all know that. Much vaulted discussion, 40% of the soldiers are Shia, etc. It'll collapse. I think it probably would, actually. The army is not necessarily, if I was the US State Department, I wouldn't be backing it blindly and said the army will do the thing for us when we ask it to, because it didn't. If you think the US government equals March the 14th equals you must stop what the opposition are doing, they didn't do that. So taking this position that we stand between the sides, they have taken the position of freezing. They're in conflict management, not conflict resolution. They're not picking sides. Why? Because of the schizophrenia that Ian was talking about earlier. And I wrote something recently describing it to the airport. Kentucky Fried Chicken posters are interspersed with Imag Mugniya, martyrdom posters. And that goes to the heart of it, really. What are we talking about here? What is the army supposed to be? Because it will reflect the nation. If the nation can't agree what it is, you're going to have a problem with the army.
I'll come back to the issue of, Hezbollah. Could anybody face to Hezbollah if the Israelis have failed? And lately the Homeland Security mentioned something that Hezbollah is more dangerous than Al-Qaeda. Could the Lebanese army have any chance?
But I don't think it wants to, and I wouldn't advocate it does. I think a confrontation with the Lebanese army and Hezbollah would be disastrous for Lebanon. My personal view is that if it isn't consensual, it cannot be delivered militarily. And former Commander Suleiman, now President Suleiman, took the same view. He said, I'm not going to put them on the street because you know what the consequence will be. It won't be good. If that goes, it'll trigger civil war, as it did in the 70s. When the army goes, you've lost everything. No, I'm not in favour of military confrontation with Hezbollah. I'm not in favour of internal or external confrontation with the arms of the resistance, because it won't be a solution. Because a solution must come from within. And we may not like Suleiman saying it's a problem that we have to decide ourselves, but it absolutely is. And if that, sorry, the final point, if we think that we can solve that for the Lebanese factions, we are gravely mistaken.
Okay, what about the region? You mentioned schizophrenia inside. It's not going to end soon. It was like this in the beginning of Lebanon. It continues. Every 20, 30 years, there's yet another upheaval. But lots of Lebanese think that, lots of the key to the locks of the problems exist in the region and in the international arena.
I sometimes wonder whether there isn't a sort of, of course it's true. You'd have to be blind, stupid and deaf to say that Lebanon is not the victim of powerful neighbours, immediate neighbours and further neighbours. The Iranians, the Syrians, the Israelis, for goodness sake, what a neighbourhood in which to exist as a fragile, divided country. Of course, you do feel sometimes, and I'm interested in what other people think about that, you do feel sometimes that that is also an excuse for Lebanese to say, what can we do? We've got all these people from Tehran to Tel Aviv plotting about what should happen in our country. What can we poor Lebanese do to influence our own fate? And it's a convincing line. I sometimes think that it's overdone, because at the end of the day, they are going to have to sort out their own problems. It's not as if anybody thinks that any of the outside actors are going to do any good. We've seen them involved in different ways over the years. They certainly don't have the interests of Lebanon at heart. Why would they? They have their own interests, and that's what they pursue. So at the end of the, it's got to be a Lebanese solution, however difficult it is.
Before I throw to the floor, but at the eve of Doha, there was a lot talked about some changing atmosphere in the region, and a new wind was blowing. We don't know where from. you know. But do you think that played a role? That the morning after we saw the deal?
I think that, you know, to conjure up a slightly complicated metaphor, it's not that there was a new wind blowing, but there really wasn't a wind blowing, in the sense that the Americans, who of course are also part of the regional and international story, really weren't present, were they? I mean, they just didn't, having made the sort of, you know, the democratization of Lebanon a sort of a triumph of the grim years that we've seen recently in the Middle East, the Cedars Revolution and the removal of the Syrians. Having done that and having secured very wide international support, it has to be said, for the Sinura government, when this crisis came, they weren't there. They didn't do anything. They sent out mixed signals, and apart from, you know, sending the USS Cole to steam up and down the coast a little bit, they really weren't there. So I think maybe the absence, if you like, of that American wind and these tired days at the end of the Bush presidency, I think that was probably the most significant international factor. And of course, the whole Iranian, American, Syrian, Israeli, you know, whatever shape that comes out as, was part of it too. But the Americans weren't there, and I think it was their absence that was the most significant international factor when on the eve of the Doha Agreement.
And before I throw to the floor, if there's anything to add, shall we take some questions and then open the discussion? Maybe Hisham, just because I know his name and, you know.
My name is Alistair Harris from Beirut, Lebanon. I was wondering, I heard a deluge of comments and so on forth made about Lebanon, but let me just remind everyone that the cause of Hezbollah that was established in 1982, I think everybody would know that it's because of Israel. I think Mr. Black said yes. I assume you should say yes.
You'll get my answer, don't worry.
As also Mr. Black said, we are endowed by very nice neighbors. Foremost amongst them is Israel. The creation of the State of Israel 60 years ago, which we celebrated, and Israel celebrated a few days back. This is the root cause of the problems in the Middle East, not only in Lebanon. Lebanon, because of the proximity, had a problem. And this problem is recurring. Every now and then we have something. But every time there is an Israeli, I'm sure. I'm not trying to defend Hezbollah, but as you have said, if you cannot have a state within a state, that's definite. But when you have Iran and United States and Israel on one side, and on the other side, Iran and Syria are having a conflict between themselves, tug of war, Lebanon is smashed in the middle. I mean, let them leave us alone and we will be very happy. We don't need anybody. Thank you very much.
I mean, I forgot to say one thing, that we accepted the statement of Hisham just because I know him and I'm moderating this, so I'm sorry, this is the Middle East today. But please keep your questions short. This way we can have and give, you know, the speakers as much time as possible to speak. And yes, Israel is the root of the problem, but we also, and a bad neighbor, but we have other bad neighbors as well, as far as the Lebanese are concerned, you know. This is the opposite, you know, thing. I think your statement was a statement. Is there a question to anybody? Or it's just like the comment?
No, this is a comment in general.
Okay.
But I could ask, why don't Israel give us Shib'a farm?
Because the Syrians will take it, but we can answer.
Okay.
And I don't think Hezbollah will resist the Syrians.
Can I respond to the gentleman's question?
We want to stop Hezbollah from becoming too strong. And one of the major points that Hezbollah puts forward is actually Shib'a farm.
Yes.
Well, let the world help us and give us back Shib'a farm, and let's battle it with Syria. That's something else. But let's finish with
Would you like me to respond to your question? Because I'd like to.
No.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, the first aspect of my response may not be to your may come as a surprise to you. You asked me if I agree that Israel is the cause of the creation of Hezbollah. The answer is that I don't entirely disagree with this point, but perhaps in a way differently to the way that you mean it to be. Let me explain what my point of view is the following. I think that Israel's war in 1982 against the PLO was absolutely correct and essential from an Israeli point of view. I think that, though, that everything good that came out of that was achieved by August 1982, and that the following 18-year involvement in Lebanon for Israel was a disaster. And so in this sense, I think that your point is correct, that Israel was responsible for the creation of Hezbollah, in the sense of the following. Because Israel did not retreat immediately from Beirut back to the international border, Israel ended up making an enemy out of a population with which it had no quarrel historically whatsoever, which is namely the Shia of the Lebanese South. And in this sense, yes, Israel was responsible for this friction with the Shia of Lebanon. Lebanon's tragedy, in addition to that, of course, was that the form that Shia resistance took to Israel was not that produced simply by the local Shia population itself. Rather, this opened the door to the involvement of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and I presume you're familiar, sir, with the way in which Hezbollah was formed. And therefore, as a result of that, from that moment on, the entry of the Iranian interest into Lebanon in a way which it seems to me at least has been disastrous for the country. Now, let me go on to just to say two more things. The involvement from that moment on and the creation of an Iranian-supported proxy militia in the country, I think has been a far greater tragedy and disaster for Lebanon, even than that of the involvement of Israel, the involvement of Syria in the country. I think it may well be, let me finish the point.
I'm sorry, I'm from the South, I disagree completely.
Okay, well, can I just finish the point and then you'll have a chance to come back at me? It seems to me that what's happened with that militia and with that involvement may well cost you your sovereignty permanently, not just temporarily. So let me finish
I'd rather lose it to them than to you.
Okay, fine. Let me finish the final point by saying the one thing. I think that we were talking about excuses. I think that, sir, if you really believe that the Shia-Sunni conflict in the region and the existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Iranian ambitions in the region are a result of the creation of Israel, then I'm afraid your logic has escaped me. And this seems to me to be the most central challenge facing the region right now.
Shall we take the question at the back there?
Hi, James Denzo, King's College. A kind of question about the elephant in the room here. This lecture is about whether ceasefire or civil war. And the one thing I haven't heard from the four panelists, which I'll be interested to hear a bit more about, is the future of the Hariri Tribunal and whether this could actually create another sort of spark to make things go backwards a tiny bit more. And a separate little point is that Gandhi never had a guided missile destroyer.
I don't know who I think maybe.
I think, James, you're quite right, of course, to ask about the Hariri Tribunal, because it is an elephant, and I think it's very interesting to raise that issue right now. I think before the crisis of May, I think it was fair to say, and accurate to say, that the Hariri Tribunal was up and running, going through significant stages of staffing and development, gathering momentum, and most important of all, it had become an irreversible reality. There was quite a long time where many of the people involved, interested in it, thought that maybe it could just be made to go away, to disappear. I think that was certainly the view in Damascus, which, as you know, had never liked at all the idea of this investigation into the Hariri killing. It's my view that in a sort of legal sense, international law, the role of the United Nations, the decisions already taken, it is still there and cannot be made to go away. And I think it's an important point to recognize that. Nobody can click their fingers and say, okay, we've decided we don't want this thing. It's there. The question is, what actually happens in reality? Now, we know that principles and reality can be very different. And I think it is entirely possible that, taken the sheer volatility of the background, its work, when it actually is constituted formally as a tribunal, which has yet to happen, its work could drag on for a very, very long time. You'll have noticed, I'm sure, the other day, it's the mandate of the investigation was extended, I think, for another 6 months until the end of the year. And I suspect that what we'll see over the coming period, in another 6 months or so, is that work will go on and that maybe there won't be very much in the way of concrete result, certainly not perhaps of the key moment of indictments issued, which is, of course, the would be, in theory, the very dramatic moment indeed. The parallel that occurs to me, for those of us who remember it, was the Lockerbie tribunal that was the Lockerbie case, where there was an investigation going on, and at one dramatic point, indictments were issued for named individuals. In that case, the two Libyans who were eventually sent to trial. If that were to happen in the Hariri case, I think it would be very dramatic. Is that going to change because of the changed circumstances in Beirut? I don't think any decisions can be revoked, but I think it might all go very slowly. That would be my feeling.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points. Firstly, obviously, I really urge everybody to talk with each other rather than past each other. That doesn't help anything, and it actually creates that expression of Lebanizing or Balkanizing, as it used to be known, the problem where everyone takes a position and then just shouts at each other. So let's try to avoid that. What I'd say on the UN, and I used to work for the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague for Yugoslavia, so a little bit about tribunals. Don't expect too much from it, and also don't think it's a huge panacea. That somehow the UN arrives like a Syria or an Israel or an America and provides the answer. It just won't do. The UN, I mean, how often do you say, oh, the UN, it's such a decisive organisation? It doesn't happen very often. So I wouldn't expect clarity from that process. And I'd also go back to my point about conflict mitigation, conflict management. I mean, it's a fair guess that many regional states and many players inside Lebanon have killed people inside Lebanon over the years. And it's a question of when you start your frame of reference. I mean, if you start with Marwan Hamadi, which is the reference for UNIC, there are many killings that went on before that. So I'm not, for a second, I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on international justice, but I would throw up issues like, for example, where we are now with the ICC in Uganda, where they say we want Joseph Kony. And the Ugandans say, well, we'd like to come to a local arrangement to ensure peace in the country. And I just throw that up as a question. Again, apologies, because I'm not really offering many answers. But would a decisive UNIC result create further instability and possibly push Lebanon off the edge? And is that the objective we want to achieve? Or do we need a process? But I would urge that if one of the regional states knew the answer to who killed Rafik Hariri, I would suggest it would have already been in the public domain. So I wouldn't hold out for that being a definitive event. If you have several dozen well-meaning internationals who are not Lebanese working in Lebanon in a highly complex environment, don't be surprised if they don't find the answer, would be my word of caution.
I mean, Lebanese, I think, are not under any, misguided impression that any answers will be total and complete. But do you believe that killing should continue? And
No, of course.
A failed state, yes, but I mean, like, should be condoned, and they shouldn't ask questions, or part of them at least, who are bothered by this killing?
But very, very briefly, because I think you want to come in on that. I mean, I'm a big fan of institutions. I mean, the judiciary is failing. The internal security forces are failing, general security are failing to divest themselves of their responsibilities. And we need to look at the fact that we haven't had an answer to any of these. And is it because of Lebanese incompetence or because of the political dynamic that goes on within the country? I would argue that the answers are probably there, but the root cause is a lack of consensus over which way the country goes forward.
Just very briefly on the more regional context, whilst it would be above my pay grade to try to imagine what the Syrian government is thinking, I have a sense that the Syrian government hopes very much that what Ian is, the scenario Ian laid out is exactly what's going to happen, that the Herald Tribunal will sort of gradually fade away into nothingness. I want to just throw out a suggestion, which is that I think, this is purely my view, that the recent negotiations between Israel and Syria on the issue of the Golan is connected to this. I think that the main reason why Syria wishes to negotiate is of course, not to make friends with Israel, but to rebuild its capital with the West. Its capital, not its capital city, but its capital with the West. I think that's already working fairly well. Bashar got his phone call from Sarkozy, as we know, after Doha. And I think part of that idea will be through rapprochement with the West, through gradually rebuilding the international name of Syria. The price of pushing the Hariri Tribunal will become such that the international community, so-called, i.e. the West, will prefer not to do so. And with a Lebanese government in which pro-Syrian elements have a blocking third, that's a pretty good hand to play when you want to make an international tribunal, just gradually chug on into nothingness.
You still have a question?
I have lots of points that I would like to make.
But if you make it brief,
okay,
maybe tag it with a question.
Can I just have one question?
That's the mic.
Sorry. I just have one question, actually. Seeing as you're, I think, the only Arabic journalist on the panel, how do you think that the journalism has actually presented itself in Lebanon, and which part did it play creating the differences which are now seen in Lebanese society, because I think the presence of television stations in the country which are very clearly biased to one point or the other have actually created a lot of the problems, a lot of the underlying hatred which was seen during the May actions. I think that that's something I know from the younger generation.
You see,
wasn't
even you are
much.
saying action, and you're not saying clashes. So we can talk till tomorrow. I think we need another session on how the media reported, and the Lebanese media reported the situation as it evolved, i.e. the clashes between Hezbollah and the
Lebanese media was reporting things extremely biased even then, during the clashes or the actions that were taking place. And I think you were at Al Arabiya, and that particular station received quite a lot of bad press amongst Lebanese people because of it became known as the Abriya amongst many Lebanese because of the way it was representing the conflicts in the country and creating more problems within people who were sitting at home who had no idea what was going on. People in the south didn't know exactly what was going on in Lebanon, and so they were receiving news from Al-Manar. Future wasn't there at the time.
Was turned off.
Yes, which I disagree with completely.
Yeah, exactly.
I disagree with silencing the press, but I also believe the press has a responsibility.
Your point is taken.
Which didn't make.
Your point was taken. I don't think anybody could own up to a good coverage of the last Lebanese crisis. And honestly, it needs a special session because also the Western press, my colleague in the Western press, and I picked on Ian the other day on the phone that nobody could capture what was happening. But again, the tools of the business are different, and also in Beirut and in Lebanon. And I go back to what I concluded my notes with. You'll get the truth, it depends from who you're getting it from. Or you'll get the facts, it depends who you're getting them from. Whether the people will know in the south exactly what happened. If they were turning on the Al-Manar, they'll get the Al-Manar version if they go. So is it honorable? Do we have a free press in the Arab world, or specifically in Lebanon, or propaganda tools? I think we're still in between somewhere.
I turned into Jazeera.
Never mind. I think, can we give the microphone just one here and one there?
You want to take the questions together?
We'll try, let's see. Is it a question or a statement?
A question. If, hypothetically, Israel did quit Shebaa farms, what military advantage would flow to Syria? And in strictly formal terms, what claims would Lebanon be left with against Israel from a Lebanese point of view?
And I'm not Lebanese, by the way. I'll leave Ian or Alistair. You're living in Lebanon, so maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is that I don't disagree with you that I would like to see the Shebaa farms possibly under UN stewardship for some time as a conflict mitigation tool. I see no harm in that. But what I would argue is the Shebaa farms will not remove the catalyst for Hezbollah's arms under no circumstances. Hezbollah themselves say that it is the threats posed by Israel, which may be prisoners, they may be other properties, they may be overflights, it may even be the existence of Israel. So I would argue that absent a regional peace between the Lebanese state and Israel, the rationale for the arms will remain. The Shebaa farms will not take away that rationale, in my personal opinion.
Maybe defending Iran also.
Can we get...
Can I respond on the Shebaa farms? I realise I didn't answer your question with regard to Shebaa. Let me very briefly just respond. 2 seconds, really. Look, Shebaa, the following thing, as you know, really 2 seconds. The UN, as you know, when Israel retreated in May 2000, concluded and even passed a resolution 1301 that Israel had withdrawn entirely to the international line. The UN concluded, UN topographers concluded, the Shebaa farms is part of Syria, part of Golan Heights, and that the issue in it is between Israel and Syria. So the answer is Israel goes along with the international point of view in this regard, at least as far as I'm aware.
Occasionally they do something.
Can I make a comment?
Can we go for a question? We'll leave the comment if we have more.
Not a
Thanks.
question, actually, it's a comment. Because the thing is, every time somebody is not with Hezbollah, I'm not with any party in Lebanon, but every time somebody is not with Hezbollah, he's like Abriya. He's always Abri. And why is so? True. It's always true. In Lebanon. Oh, and when you say something against Hezbollah, everybody will say, you're with the Israeli state.
Not really.
I tried to skirt off this, but I can tell you that the editorial staff of Arabiya, and this is an insider view and I shouldn't share it with anybody, you go and look at who are the editor and the producers.
I'm not looking at the editors, I'm looking at who owns it.
No. The ownership is one thing, but look at the line, honestly, beside. Maybe it strikes a balance, whoever. I mean, the Saudis, the Pro 14, you want to say, and the staff are all Hezbollah, ex-communist Syrian Populist Party and stuff who reflect the other opinion. So there is a good and I believe a very healthy battle for the good information in Arabiya. I'll come to you, but there is a gentleman there, the lady or gentleman, sorry. And there is there, and then there is one.
Hugo van Randwyk. You know, the issue of Israel being the enemy of Lebanon and not allowing the Palestinian refugees to return to their ancestral towns and to register to vote and to vote for the Knesset. That seems to be a problem for the Israelis. How about the Lebanese trying an asymmetric approach? I don't know if you're familiar, but Afghan refugees in Iran and Pakistan voted using out-of-country voting, which is valid inside Afghanistan. How about the Lebanese politicians supporting a process of registering the Palestinian voters in Lebanon, but linking their registration to ancestral towns, and 1 week before Knesset elections, allowing them to vote, including all the other Palestinians around the world?
You mean to vote in Israel, basically?
No, what they would do is they would vote, and the international community would see what those votes were legitimate for the Knesset, just like American troops in Iraq will vote in presidential elections in America, and say, well, these people, their votes are, and the world can then decide who are the legitimate government in the Knesset. Because there's about 2 million over 18 Palestinian voters and about 600,000 already in Israel who could vote.
Okay, so basically,
what can I say to such a suggestion? I mean, yeah, of course, this could be one. There are many PR ideas which the Palestinians in Lebanon have. If I'm not mistaken, Osama Hamdan of Hamas was talking recently about the idea of a sort of mass demonstration of Palestinian refugees and their descendants sort of marching down towards Israel and northern border. I mean, I hesitate to comment. I'm sure that they're great at PR and so on and so forth. Let me just say one thing. Those, it seems to me at least, who remain fixated on the refugees and their descendants, I think are doing the Palestinians a greater disservice than they're doing us. And if you want there to be a peaceful solution, I would advise those who care about the Palestinians to try to move beyond this kind of way of looking at the issue.
Can we have the question in the back, please?
Hi, Ramsey Schwartz, journalist. I'm going to move away from Israel and Palestinians, although the Palestinian issue in Lebanon is a serious problem.
Can we try to go back to ceasefire and
that's what I was going to talk about. I think there's there's a deep issue here, and it's very, very clear that the Lebanese are not divided, have never been, are not united.
That was a revelation.
They've never been united, and you have a lot of, there aren't any real sort of political isms in Lebanon these days, apart from really tribalism. And I've lived in Lebanon for the last sort of 6 years or so, I'm currently in London. But the question I'd like to put to you is that when you have so many former militia leaders and tribes who sort of clearly follow the leaders, relate to each other, and are always sort of really clashing with each other. And on top of this, there is a deep, deep internal racism between various religious groups, let's say, that is sort of somehow inbred, not amongst a lot of young people, but amongst a certain generation. This doesn't go away. This is sort of there, and I think this is a big problem, and I think you should answer that.
Racism, can we call it racism, or what is dividing the Lebanese?
I don't think racism is the right word at all, I have to say. I think it's, the significant differences of religion, confession.
Can we say that the identity of Lebanon hasn't metamorphosed, hasn't become something? They still take their cue from their religious leaders or from the clan leaders. The client-patron relationship continues to exist. I agree with you, but
if you ask a lot of young people today, they will tell you from across all sort of religions. They'll ask you, who represents us? Who really represents what we think?
But they're
and they're not there, and they struggle to see how we've got leaders who sort of have been in power for a long time, who have committed numerous crimes on all sides, are still there, and are still not actually really striving to do something to sort of reconciliate. And I think the problem with Doha is that there is a lull, and I agree with you, that's all there. But if you think all these individual leaders have sort of forgiven and forgotten, I don't think that's true.
Can I ask you, what do you suggest, for example? I'm
not suggesting anything, I'm asking you.
No, I mean, just what do you suggest, to overturn this? I mean, if the young people should represent themselves more, should speak out more, should be involved in the political process more, what if the weapons are raised in their faces again, and become immediately
you talk about one group having weapons, but everyone has weapons in Lebanon.
I'm saying that's it. So should they carry weapons as well and
fight
their ideas and stuff?
People need to feel that they can express
the dialogue has stopped in Lebanon.
Well, maybe it has, but that's the problem.
Anybody has something?
I mean, I don't know. It's a lot of questions, if that was a question. There's a lot of issues in there. There was something recent in the papers in Lebanon about someone doing a PhD in Lebanon on what Phoenicianism was. You know, the great thing that we're not Lebanese, but Phoenicians from certain confessions. And the irony of the PhD is it turned out that everybody who was currently Sunni, Shia, Druze, Maronite, and everything else was that they were all originally from the Phoenician stock. So potentially quite a sort of reassuring point. But I agree with you entirely. I hate to harp on that same point. Is there's no social contract between the people and the people who govern them. And there's separate issues that fall out from what you said about no peace without justice. And I agree with you, there are big issues that haven't been addressed. And there are pros and cons, truth and reconciliation committees, there's a lot in there. But what I would say that the fundamental challenge is to make people realize the state is there to serve them, rather than a predatory reversal. That is not an easy thing, but I don't think we're moving in the right direction either. I read somewhere recently, I think between 1943 and 82, there were 40 different prime ministers in Lebanon from 4 different families. That's a really big issue.
But that sense of the state not serving the people is not unique to Lebanon.
Just on this last question, just very briefly, I don't wish to, I have a sense in a way that this discussion is not something I ought to comment on, only to say the following thing. To say something hopeful, perhaps. Lebanese friends from all sides tell me that there is an enormous reluctance amongst young people, sometimes going beyond political logic in the cold sense, an enormous reluctance for there to be civil war again in Lebanon, and that there is a very strong memory of what took place, and there is a desire, almost going beyond the political logic of the day-to-day thing, to say anything but civil war. If one can perhaps try and hold on to some element of hope with what's happened, then it seems to me that this may be a pointer towards something good for the long term.
I was going to ask the panel, sorry, my name is Farouk Bajwa. I was going to ask the panel that nobody's talked about democracy or a new constitution in Lebanon. And you mentioned, sorry, I couldn't remember your name, you mentioned the fact that there is this strange constitution where there has to be a Maronite Christian president, there has to be a Sunni prime minister. I mean, this is nonsense in the modern world. I mean, obviously, if any country in the world is to
Lebanon is not modern yet.
War, it has to be one man, one vote. We have to have a proper democracy. There has to be a social contract. And this is bizarre that in all this discussion we've had this evening, no one has talked about one man, one vote. In a recent survey last year, carried out by the American University in Beirut, 80% of Christians supported Hezbollah, and 80% of Sunni supported it. So I think this idea of a sectarian Hezbollah, I'm not a Hezbollah fan, I'm not Shia either, but I think that if Hezbollah is the most popular party in Lebanon and they're going to win an election, then as Hamas won it in Palestine, they should be allowed to govern.
I think we call it one person, one vote these days.
Anybody want to say anything to this, or we take the next question?
We can come back to this.
Thank you.
My name is Walid Kurdi. I'm from Beirut. I heard a lot of sort of complicated arguments and sometimes confusing the strategic with the tactical, with the circumstantial. I have a wish that at the end, if we have an answer, whether it will be a ceasefire or civil war, at least I can add one question if I can have an answer for, which is for how long. That's one thing. The other thing is, in the discussions about the regional powers and the intersection of the interests of these regional powers, which are carried by local people in Lebanon or local groups. One regional power which hasn't been mentioned is Saudi Arabia. And what I would like, my question is, what do you think the role of Saudi Arabia is in Lebanon, and the efficacy of that role, at least so far? Thank you.
Ian, do you want to take this question?
Well, I mean, just a few thoughts. Well, on the how long is it going to last? I mean, I think the Lebanese that I've spoken to in the last, couple of weeks since this agreement, nearly everybody is pessimistic. They say that this is all temporary, and the longest it will last will be until the elections next May. So I think clearly there's understandable relief that the crisis was averted, it was put off. But I haven't yet heard anybody who thinks that it's a permanent solution, and everybody is looking to the elections in May. On the Saudis, they've obviously been very supportive of March the 14th. There's the Hariri connection, which is important. I think everybody would agree that there's a sort of Syrian-Saudi tension that is very central to this whole process, and it's one of the reasons why it took so long for the issue to be resolved. And it was only, of course, when Hezbollah brought things to the brink, or the government brought things to the brink, whichever version you choose to believe, that deadlock was able to be broken. But they're obviously an important player, and you're right to mention them, certainly.
So just a very quick point. I mean, you're right, the model is difficult. I mean, the worst thing you can have in a constitutional democracy is 3 blocks of basically the same size. Because what you do is you appeal externally, as we all know, and that's not going to go away. Your only response to that is to say there has to be a bargain between those 3 blocks, and I'm talking the Sunni Christian blocks, to say that a bit like we reached an accord before, it'll be that none of us appeal externally. Very difficult to achieve, and I'm not offering any solutions here, and I'm very loath to sit here as a foreigner and tell the Lebanese how to run their own country. What I would say is it's not working. Okay, and I totally agree that we are in a ceasefire. It's not over. There will be more problems unless we have consensus on what Lebanon is for its constituent population. And no one's mentioned the census yet, but people talk about the population of Lebanon. No one really knows.
Consensus. There is. I'll let other people speak. Forgive me, but.
I know it's a bit early to comment. Sorry. Hi. I was just wondering, because of the Democratic nomination, if you guys wanted to comment a little bit about the American election. Is it too early? How do you think the outcome either way will affect this, or will it not at all? Will America kind of still stay out of it, drag its head, give mixed signals, or do you think it could really play out, if Barak decides to meet Iran, or if McCain decides to crush Iran? So what do you think will happen?
I don't know if who wants to say. I'm just gonna interfere and say 2 words. I don't think we'll wait for whoever comes into power, and we'll wait till next May and beyond May. They will learn the rope of the Middle East, and they will be out before a new policy is maybe ripe or ready. And then by the time they leave, we have new hope. There are new development. The scene in the Middle East is moving so quickly, so fast, that no American policy will catch up with it. I mean, globally they have a certain policy, but on what you call it, the day-to-day details, Iran, Syria, Saudi, Egypt, the Lebanese parties among themselves, they are faster and they move on. And by the time the administration catches up, it's already on its way out.
I'd just like to say, I think that the American election is going to be of enormous importance here. First of all, let's be aware that everybody is now waiting in any case, because people regard the Bush administration as being, of course, in its death throes. So what comes next will be of, I think, very great importance. You should be aware that, I mean, in Damascus, for example, great hope is being put on Barack Obama, apparently, and on his statements with regard to the need to engage with Syria. I think that there's something to worry about. From an Israeli point of view or other point of view, I think there's less to worry about. But if I was a pro-March 14th Lebanese, I would be somewhat worried at the possibility of an Obama victory. I think that there has clearly, from the Republican Party's point of view, there is clearly a certain investment in not at least seeing the whole March 14th project go down the drain, which I think would probably go on and filter into a McCain presidency. From a Democrat point of view, the issues and the sense of what's necessary will be quite different. And from the March 14th Lebanese point of view, which I say, I'm able to, I don't want to say it's the democratic Lebanese point of view, but at least in my humble outsider's opinion, it represents the best hope for the country in the longer term. From this point of view, I think there's much to worry about from an Obama victory. If, for example, there were to be, I don't believe there will be, but if there were to be a successful negotiation between Israel and Syria on the Golan Heights, for reasons we can go into, I don't think there will be, but were there to be so, one should be aware that Israel will not be the one to try to look after March 14th Lebanese sovereignty. Israel will be perfectly happy for the Syrians to be custodians of Lebanon, because Israel wants peace and quiet in the north. That's its first interest. So the only way March 14th is going to survive is going to be if somebody in Washington cares very much to keep them alive. And I'm not quite convinced that President Obama will have that first and foremost on his mind.
I just want to make a very small point, and I made no apologies. I'm a big advocate of dialogue with almost everybody. And I'd be even more controversial. I think Mohammed wants that. Let's hold up 2 examples. Gaddafi, pretty bad guy, is not aspiring to have all those nice, he already has them, and Lockerbie, and. Where's he now? He's still in charge, and he's a good guy, everyone likes him. In caveats, okay. Another guy we don't like, and we don't talk to him at all, Saddam Hussein, and what happens to him? Well, the gallows, and look what's happening in Iraq. Now, they're not comparable in any way. I'm just trying to be controversial to say that dialogue, per se, is not admitting legitimacy. It's just agreeing to dialogue. I personally can't think of the last time that we reached an accommodation with someone we didn't talk to, because by definition you don't know their bottom line. So I would just put it up there that dialogue itself does not infer legitimacy. It doesn't. It just confers, I am open to hear what you have to say.
Ian, the Americans, will it change anything?
I thought Obama's speech yesterday, which of course we have to remember was made to the most powerful pro-Israeli lobbying organization in the world, I thought it had several interesting things in it. I thought it was good for Israel, bad for the Palestinians. I thought that it was interesting, beside a hawkish insistence that on Iran the military option was on the table. I think he used the phrase meaningful incentives, and he talked about a readiness to talk, albeit on American terms. But I thought the tone on Iran was quite significantly different from what we've heard from the Bush administration. I thought he was good on Iraq, a sort of cool, sensible line about getting out after having thought about it, as opposed to the mess that was created by not having thought about it, by having the war in the first place. I thought that was good. And I think on the point that Jonathan was making about, which we could put under the heading of democracy promotion, I thought Obama was distancing himself quite significantly from the sort of Bush neocon freedom agenda, which clearly, anyway, Bush abandoned the moment that it produced unpalatable results, and with Hamas, which is slightly a special case, but with the Egyptians and so on. But I thought that Obama was sort of signaling there, very early days, that he wasn't going to be involved in promoting grand projects. And I think in that sense, maybe March the 14th will not be the darling of an Obama Democratic administration. And I thought he was pragmatic also on the Syrians as well, which was a significant shift from what we've heard from the Bushies.
How much time more we have? We have another 10 minutes, so we can go for another round of questions. We'll get maybe hands that are raised for the first time. 1, 2, 3.
Lara Shalita, Lebanese. My question and comment are addressed to Jonathan. The latest incidents have shown that everybody is armed in Lebanon at various levels, of course. You've put forth a metaphor which is Gandhi and Genghis Khan. I would have personally said David and Goliath, because how Gandhi-like and peaceful would you describe the military trainings that members of the Future Movement have been receiving in Jordan for the past 2 years?
I'm gonna just take this answer just because I'm from Beirut and I never, I'm the moderator. Yeah. But if you kind of compare David and Goliath, and you're gonna say about some ragtag security forces beefed up to look like they are really battle-hardened security officers here and there, they will not compare. And I think you're reasonable enough to think with the battle-hardened 30 years training of the Hezbollah, with all the communication infrastructure, with all the weaponry, with all the high-tech command and control thing. It was playing out like a video game on the streets of Beirut.
But if the Future Movement was planning on going forth for a non-violent solution, why would they go for military training?
I mean, we can talk till tomorrow and disagree, but I'm trying to tell you here that if you reasonably think that, and you live in Beirut, which is great, and your mind is telling you that, that's what you saw about people with some personal weapons can compare to the infrastructure of Hezbollah, well, I don't understand anything, and I don't know anything in neither Lebanese politics or Middle East politics. Can we have the second question?
Can I just respond, because you did ask just one thing, that the metaphor is Nadim Shkhadi, not me. So on this point at least I'm innocent, firstly. Secondly, just to say, I mean, I've heard many different things, so I'm very interested to hear what you're having to say. From people in Beirut have told me different things, and there are those who certainly have told me, who I have no reason to think are are trying to lie and manipulate, that the Haredi people who went onto the streets were taking their personal weapons, were poorly organised, were not trying, and that's why they were swatted aside so very quickly. Exactly. And let's remember that it was the Hezbollah people, if I'm not mistaken, were only engaged for the first day or so. After that, they left the work to Amal because it was so unserious they could even let the Amal people do it. So who knows?
Yeah, hi, my name is Phil Bristow. I work for AKE Group, a security risk company. I have a question for both Ian and Alistair regarding the institutions of the state. You said that Lebanon is essentially a failed state, and therefore all of the institutions, including the army, is basically non-viable in any future conflict or resolution of the conflict. But then after that, you've also said that the only solution is through the Lebanese themselves. But without the institutions, then how are they going to solve this particular problem?
Very quickly, I mean, I think the answer lies in institutions. I'm not saying institutions are perfect. It doesn't mean you should bypass them. They need reinforcement. My point would be, if it comes down to it, whatever we think, Hezbollah aren't going away. The arms aren't going away. The recent instance, whatever you think, whatever your bottom line is, whatever your vitriol is, they're not going away. And they're not going to be defeated militarily by March the 14th, by Israel, by the US. They're not going away because they're part of the Lebanese fabric. Now, the reason I mentioned national security debate, I mentioned institutions, I mentioned the armed forces, is I would like an honest debate amongst the silent majority we've spoken much of here, the people of Lebanon. Who do you feel threatens you, in what way, and what is the appropriate response? And the answer might not be the Islamic resistance. It might not be. But that debate is critical. And either we back the institutions of state, which I think are very important, or we accept the state doesn't exist. And I'm not ready yet to say the state isn't worth reinforcing. The institutions of state must be the answer, despite their clear deficiencies.
But don't you think that this has changed after what happened early May? I.e., who is threatening you today in Lebanon? Do they really evoke Israel? Or?
I mean, yeah, I think this is very difficult. I mean, there's a dichotomy at the heart of this. If Hezbollah go, the problem is, you see, the army's so weak, they can't defend Lebanon against Israel. But actually, the actions of Hezbollah have weakened the armed forces at the same time. So, I mean, if you look at the current events, you need to go back a step before to the shootings in Mar Michael a few months earlier, where 7-9 Shia were killed by the army. Huge outcry, but emasculated the army. They did intervene in a particular instant, and people were shot, unfortunately. And there's a lot that could be said there about the fact you need non-lethal weapons, you need to bolster the army, the police, etc. But the point is, the army is clearly hamstrung currently. You need to find a way around that, and that must come from internal consensus over what the army's role is, what the police's role is, what the resistance's role is.
But isn't one of the elements of the Doha Agreement that there's supposed to be a dialogue on these national security issues? And isn't there the possibility, however remote, and I agree it's pretty remote, that Hezbollah, which is, if nothing else, is a significant and highly experienced military force, could in some revamped consensual Lebanese state take up its place with pride in the Lebanese armed forces in some yet unthought of structure, the resistance battalions of the Lebanese army. I mean, you can only think within terms of the state. You can't think outside it. That's the whole difficulty.
But what about if Hezbollah is thinking outside of in terms of the state? What about if Hezbollah, for example, wishes to turn its weapons on Israel because of an interest which Iran has or its backers have?
Well,
then it's thinking outside of the state.
I think this is a dimension that we haven't explored yet, the Iranian dimension in the whole discussion. But we'll come to that. Can I take this,
I'd like
this
to,
last question, and then I'll ask you about the Iranian dimension.
I'd like to agree with Jonathan that Israel does want peace in the north. It's the type of peace that when you have your boot on another person's neck.
You don't agree with me.
Can I ask you directly, Jonathan, does Lebanon, considering that you've described, or the panel has described the Lebanese army as a paper tiger, does Lebanon have a right to a military deterrence?
You're asking me? Yeah, the answer, of course, is absolutely Lebanon has a right to an army. I think what Lebanon, in my view at least, does not have the right. Yeah, in my view at least, what Lebanon, or not Lebanon, what Hezbollah does not have the right to do is it does not have the right to launch aggression against Israel on no basis whatsoever, except for the issue of an imagined issue of a piece of territory which belongs to Syria in any case. Look, this is the point. Yeah, absolutely. It applies to Israel also. If a radical Jewish militia were to emerge in Israel in the north, seize control, hold on a minute, seize control of the northern border, and then choose to sort of unilaterally make war against Lebanon or against the Shia of southern Lebanon, that would be absolutely wrong. That's parallel to what happened with regard to Hezbollah. As I say, Israel have suffered from it. I think the key point which we're really talking about here is that the main people who are the victims of this, of course, are the people of Lebanon themselves, because Israel is capable of defending itself against Hezbollah and of deterring Hezbollah, I think, yeah, for sure. The people who are unfortunately too weak to do so are the people within Lebanon.
In the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to ask maybe a couple of questions about the Iranian dimension in the whole issue. Do you believe that Iran has a forward base on the Mediterranean and on the northern border of Israel? I know that the hands have been raised, and there are many in the last 5 minutes, but...
Yeah, I mean, I am going to answer that, but I'm just going to say one thing. I don't believe for a second the Lebanese army is a paper tiger. I just want to make that quite clear. On the question of Iran, I mean, I think one can over-exaggerate the... well, maybe they are, but contextualize the army. It may not be particularly effective, but it's the best option we have, in my opinion, institutionally. But the question of Iran, I mean, the Iranian role within Hezbollah's development and evolution has changed over time, and things do change over time. There's no doubt there is a regional dimension to Hezbollah's power within Lebanon, no doubt whatsoever. And a regional solution would emasculate Hezbollah, because the rationale for Hezbollah's existence would go away. My point would be, whether it be its Iranian supporters or its Syrian supporters, until the rationale for that support evaporates, which is a regional peace settlement, Hezbollah will maintain its armed presence. The bottom line, though, is do you think the trajectory of Hezbollah and the trajectory of Lebanon are diametrically opposed? If they are, the state is finished in the long run. And the challenge would be, how do you combine those trajectories to bring a unified vision of the Lebanese state? I would argue outside of a regional peace, very, very difficult, if not impossible. Ian?
Well, I think this is the most intriguing question, actually, of the sort of geopolitical questions that arise out of this very interesting discussion. And that is this. What is Hezbollah? Hezbollah is simultaneously an authentic Lebanese movement with social roots and strong support, and at the same time it is a very powerful guerrilla organization which enjoys the support of Iran and Syria. And it is both those things simultaneously, and it raises very difficult questions. I mean, it's absolutely, to my mind, the heart of the issue. And I have no clear answer. How do you apportion those different elements? They're both true. I mean, you know, there's this ambiguity on two key fronts. There is ambiguity about Hezbollah's ambitions for Lebanon itself. Nasrallah gave, I thought, a rather conciliatory speech after these recent events. You didn't necessarily have to believe it, but he was certainly trying to be conciliatory and to say, no, we don't want to take over Lebanon. True, a bit rich after his own militia had just used its weapons against the Lebanese people, but that is what he said. And on the other ambiguity is about Israel. What is Hezbollah's real fundamental attitude to Israel? It's very hard to work it out. There are messages of extreme hostility, which can clearly be interpreted as rejecting the very existence of the Zionist state, the Zionist enemy, all that familiar terminology. On the other hand, if Hezbollah bills itself as it does, quintessentially as the resistance, that is its name and everybody knows, if there is no cause for resisting that enemy, if the Shabab farms are returned, if the prisoners are freed, if the overflights are reduced to manageable dimensions, all these things could actually happen. Then what will Hezbollah be resisting? I think these are key questions, and I don't think any of us can actually answer, but they're very important.
Just very briefly on this, I think I agree very much with the first part of what you said, which is this sort of dichotomy and dilemma of Hezbollah as a representative of Lebanese Shia and at the same time as a client of Iran. Let me just make, and I think it is a dilemma, let me just raise or make two additional points. Regarding Hezbollah's attitude towards Israel, let's be sensible here and be frank. You don't build up an arsenal of 40,000 rockets, medium-range rockets, in order to liberate an agricultural area of 20 square kilometers. This is nonsense, and it is an insult to the intelligence. With regard to what Hezbollah...
So this is the Iranian dimension.
This is the Iranian dimension. With regard to what Hezbollah thinks about Israel, I recommend people read that well-known Zionist propagandist Amal Saad Ghuraib in her book about Hezbollah, because what she says very openly in a whole chapter is exactly what the movement's attitude towards Israel is, which is that the movement has been, from its very outset, infused with very, very extreme anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli rhetoric and rejects totally the right of Israel to exist. This is absolutely without ambiguity, and this is very, very clear. So just with regard to the Iranian point, the issue is this. Iran, it is the Iranian connection which has allowed this movement to grow beyond the dimensions of other Lebanese militias, and in a sense to grow beyond the dimensions of Lebanese politics as a whole and to become a factor, a regional factor, present in Lebanon, but operating on a logic and on a dynamic which is no longer Lebanese alone. And this, I think, is the key point.
We're talking about Lebanon, and I don't want the last word to be the Israeli dimension, otherwise I would have stopped it here.
Fair enough.
But I'm going to take maybe a couple of questions of people who haven't spoken yet, please. That's one person raising her hand.
Yes, hi. My question is perhaps related to a point raised about the sort of nature of Hezbollah, and I was wondering if we go back to the 2006 Israeli war, the summer war with Israel. I think everyone would agree that after that, Hezbollah sort of, acquired certain recognition amongst, large portion of Lebanese people. And I was relating that to the latest clashes in May. And if we look at the step that Hezbollah took in terms of crossing that line, if they made that decision based on a sort of cost-benefit analysis, the cost being that they would lose a certain support amongst perhaps non-Shia Lebanese, and the benefit being that they would, coerce the government into, recognizing that amount. Do you think that the cost paid was too high, or is that likely to have certain implications in the longer term rather than immediately terms?
Ian or Alistair?
I'm not sure that cost in the way you mentioned would be in their calculation. It's not a question of if we do this, will we lose more popular votes when it comes to democratic elections. I don't think that's the equation, quite frankly. I think there is an absolute bar on touching the weapons of resistance. Nasrallah said, if you touch it, I'll cut your hand off. He said in May, you touched it, I'll cut your hand off. And it's simple as that. It's not a question of what will that do to my core votes in the Shuf amongst the Druze. Not that bothered, actually. Because the bottom line is that's what it's all about. It's not about representation, it's about resistance. Okay, so don't think of it, I think, my personal, don't look at it through a political dimension. How's that going to do in terms of votes? I don't think that's the core issue.
But Nasrallah did say, somebody may remember precisely when this was, but not long after the war, Nasrallah made a speech in which he appeared to acknowledge quite explicitly that he had miscalculated, that he thought he was carrying out a raid across the border to secure more prisoners to swap, when we know that this is an important preoccupation for Hezbollah, and didn't anticipate the reaction that came. So, I mean, I would say there is some evidence that he himself, and he's clearly no fool, Nasrallah, whatever else you think of him, whether you like him or loathe him, he appeared to recognize that he made a significant error. But it's also true, having said that, I think it's worth repeating, and I think it goes back to what remains to me, this question of ambiguity, and I do think there is an ambiguity there, that there are enough sources to suggest that it is correct. I include the UN in this, who I think have a reasonable reputation for objectivity on this point, that Hezbollah has massively rearmed since the 2006 war. And that's not something that we should, I think, in having this discussion, pretend is not there. If there are 40,000 rockets, and I've heard similar figures, and I think they're widely reported, then I think that does have to tell us something about what this organization wants to do. Is it just about defending Lebanon, or is it something else?
I mean, as a Lebanese, I don't believe so. Cynically, on this note, I mean, 9 o'clock, can we overrun for how long? But I believe that things, when they overrun, they lose their, excitement. So I leave this question, maybe we can talk while going out all together. And let me just thank Jonathan and Ian and also Alistair and the Frontline Club for having this discussion. Discussing Lebanon will never be enough in 1 hour, but I think we cannot go for the whole of the night. Thank you very much for all for coming.